Well, I'd always been into electronic music. I'm a keyboard player primarily, and I also like the idea of making some sort of music that was very aggressive or had some sort of statement to be made lyrically or musically.
Although many people have played a significant part in Nine Inch Nails over the years, the band is essentially one man. A gentle, softly spoken, thoughtful person, Trent Reznor has been the consistent inspiring force behind Nine Inch Nails since their conception. A unique and controversial character, Reznor has never shied away from what he truly believes in. From an early age, Reznor showed a strong passion for music. As a child, his talents were revered as a classical pianist, which gave him a sound knowledge of musical structure and the dedication needed to improve, although this music was of course a million miles away from the in-your-face noise that Nine Inch Nails later came to produce. Critics and fans have labelled Nine Inch Nails music industrial, a term given to music reminiscent of the violent noise of heavy machinery grinding away. But the term existed long before Nine Inch Nails, used to refer to bands like Ministry and Skinny Puppy, and in fact it is a term which Reznor has always tried to distance himself and Nine Inch Nails from. Whereas industrial bands had offered little in the way of musical structure, this has always been more evident in Nine Inch Nails' work. While few industrial bands have reached mainstream audiences, Nine Inch Nails have sold millions of copies worldwide, appealing to fans of hardcore, alternative, heavy rock, and even pop music. Evidence of this was provided when their 1999 album, The Fragile, topped the US charts in the week of its release. To say Reznor has come a long way since his childhood days in small-town Pennsylvania is a huge understatement. His nature of constantly striving to improve and succeed, and his intense energy and enthusiasm for the music he believes in, have helped him to overcome bouts of depression and to use these later more productively in his deeply personal lyrics. As a consequence, he has established Nine Inch Nails as a mighty force to be reckoned with.
What had influenced me at the time a lot was a lot of the bands on the Wax Trax label in America, such as Ministry, Skinny Puppy to some extent, Fetus, bands like that.
Mercer, Pennsylvania, a small rural farming town, was the birthplace of Michael Trent Reznor on the morning of May 17, 1965. The child came to be known simply as Trent because his father shared the name Michael. Reznor's father had been an amateur bluegrass musician, a style which had originated from rural America decades before. He had also worked as a commercial artist and an interior designer, although his son would show a lack of interest in the latter of these professions. Michael had married a young girl called Nancy Clark, whilst both were teenagers in Texas. A few years after Trent came a daughter, Tira. Not too long after Tira was born, Michael and Nancy split up. Tira stayed with Nancy whilst 6-year-old Trent moved in with his grandparents, and despite the breakup, he had a happy childhood. Although he was a reasonably shy child, he did the same things as most children. The usual boys' stuff of fishing and building model aeroplanes, both of which require a great deal of concentration and patience. Other hobbies which required an even greater degree of commitment were music-based. He studied the brass instruments of saxophone, tuba and trumpet, although his real talent emerged as a classical pianist, and he worked extremely hard, trying to improve and push himself further still. As his musical abilities grew and were recognised, so too did his self-confidence and even his popularity at school. At both Mercer Junior School and Senior High School, Reznor continued to practice his tenor saxophone, and his hard work was rewarded with places in the school's jazz and marching bands. He also showed promise in his drama class and played prominent roles in 2 of his high school's productions. One of these was Jesus Christ Superstar, and the other was the aptly titled Music Man. Apart from music and drama, school did not appeal to Reznor. He hated it, and his attitude reflected this, so it was no surprise that his grades weren't as high as they could have been. When he was in his early teens, although he could appreciate and enjoy music, he had no real access to any significant new sounds. Across the Atlantic in London, and even closer to home in New York, a revolution was taking place as punk emerged from the underground music scene into the mainstream, offering the opportunity for anyone to pick up a guitar and play. Unfortunately, Reznor was oblivious to this, due to the lack of college radio and alternative culture in Mercer. By the time he did get to hear punk, its peak had already passed him by. MTV had not reared its head yet. The only escapism from small-town life that Reznor could indulge in was through science fiction comics and magazines, television and movies. One movie that made a lasting impression on Reznor was The Exorcist, a harrowing and disturbing film showing the work of evil entering a young child's body and mind. Needless to say, this film scared the life out of Reznor, as it did to many others, no doubt. This introduced Reznor to the darker side of life and the exorcising of demons, a theme that would regularly appear in his later lyrics. It was whilst Reznor was at high school that he heard the American rock group Kiss, who he thought of as evil yet exciting. With their theatrical image, heavy makeup and black leather, they offered an alternative to Reznor's musical environment up to then. Almost immediately he dropped his classical piano training and began to experiment with a very different, more do-it-yourself sound. His father owned a local music store and was kind enough to buy his aspiring rock and roll son an electric piano, which was soon to be followed by a guitar. He took lessons from his father for a couple of months before going it alone, experimenting and playing around with the instrument, seeing if he could do it by himself. Due to his lack of proper training, he never really learnt to play the guitar very well, but he had at least developed his own technique and style. With the help of other musically inclined friends, Reznor formed a series of what he would later describe as terrible garage bands. They were given permission by Reznor's encouraging father to rehearse in the back room of his store, although it remains unclear whether this helped with instrument sales. Reznor displayed an insatiable appetite for learning new instruments, which resulted in him playing Moog and keyboards with some of these bands. It became apparent that music was beginning to offer options in terms of escaping the small-town life that Reznor was growing to dislike and was keen to break away from.
I just thought it was cool that this is this real intense, grinding music that couldn't have been made 20 years ago because the technology didn't exist to do that. And it was just a kind of a new, not really new, but using new technology to create music that could be considered, I guess, rock music, but it's not done with guitar, bass, drum format.
By 1983, MTV was offering the opportunity for bands to project their images into the homes of the public, and with this came many of the image-conscious keyboard-based groups of the early 1980s. The likes of Duran Duran, Soft Cell, Eurythmics and Depeche Mode had taken full advantage of this new platform, and their influence spread, soon to be followed by a huge wave of synthesizer groups, which would offer something a little more than the middle-of-the-road music that was currently topping the charts. It was during this exciting period that an 18-year-old Reznor managed to get away from his hometown. He moved just north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he enrolled at a small art school called Allegheny College. He studied music and computer engineering, both of which would serve him well for his future career. He was keen to make a fresh start and approached his new life with optimism and hope. Although still reasonably shy, he made every conceivable effort to fit in and make new friends, but even so, he still felt like an outsider. Some of the small handful of friends that he did make joined him in a local group called Option 30. They were mainly a covers band, reworking tracks by well-established acts such as U2 and Billy Idol, but also producing original material, some written by Reznor himself. Whilst studying and playing these small gigs with Option 30, Reznor was spending the remainder of his time working on his own material in his dorm room. He had begun to collect a vast amount of musical equipment, mostly electronic, with which he wrote his early songs. Although these were machine-based, they were essentially pop songs, with the traditional pop structure of verses, chords and a melody, but as yet his lyrics were undeveloped and not as individual as they would later become. In his room, Reznor experimented as much as he had done previously with his guitar and began to establish a unique, untutored sound. By the end of his first year at Allegheny, Reznor's interest in music had begun to dominate his thoughts and time. His studying had started to suffer as a result of this, but his music was beginning to improve. The band were getting more gigs and having to travel far and wide for many of them. Reznor changed his schedule and began to study just 2 days each week, which allowed him more freedom as a musician. He was becoming more and more focused on his musical career, which was beginning to take off and offer glimpses of a life he was growing more and more attracted to. Understandably, his studying suffered dramatically. It was extremely difficult for him to continue with his double life, and before long he dropped out of college altogether to pursue what had become his overriding obsession. He had become so interested in the programming side to his music that he actually craved a hands-on learning experience in a recording studio, but would have to wait a while for this. In the meantime, Reznor moved back with his ever-supportive father and began playing with covers bands again. Although this paid the bills, it was not what he really wanted, and within a year he felt the urge to move on once again.
Pretty much during the course of 1988, I had worked in a studio in Cleveland, Ohio, and toyed around with the idea of making music, collaborating, whatever, but I couldn't find anybody I wanted to work with, so I just did it myself.
Cleveland, Ohio once had a thriving underground music scene from which influential bands such as Pere Ubu and Rocket from the Tombs had emerged. This scene had subsided, but to the increasingly focused Reznor, it offered a wealth of musical opportunities in comparison to Pennsylvania. It proved to be a wise move, and from this period things began to go Reznor's way. On many occasions, Reznor could be found hanging out at the local music store specialising in high-technology electronic equipment. The latest drum machines, sequencers and synthesizers could all be tried out in the store, so it was no surprise that Reznor was attracted to the place. He ended up spending so much time there that they eventually offered him a job, which he gratefully accepted. An old friend from Mercer by the name of Chris Vranner was one of his colleagues at the store, and the pair of them quickly renewed their strong bond. Before long they were sharing an apartment, and though luxury wasn't the order of the day, they scraped by. During this period, Reznor's musical knowledge expanded, and he was introduced to many industrial bands. One of the most influential for Reznor was the Chicago outfit Ministry, who had a hard-hitting sound, created and fronted by Al Jorgensen, who featured heavily in the industrial underground scene. Whilst working at the store, Reznor joined various bands, including The Innocents and The Urge. He also played live and recorded an LP with Lucky Pierre, led by Kevin McMahon, a familiar face on the Cleveland scene, and someone who Reznor would later cross paths with again. Of all the bands that Reznor played with during the mid-80s, the most respected were the Exotic Birds, who produced a dark brand of epic rock. Vranner played drums in the group, and this was to be the first of many collaborations between the two friends. Also involved was Nick Rush, who would later join 9 Inch Nails on tour. Already, Reznor was making contacts that he would be able to use later in 9 Inch Nails, an idea that was beginning to push its way to the forefront of his mind. It was around this time, in 1987, that Reznor and Vale, another band member, took time out from Exotic Birds to appear briefly in a local movie called Light of Day. The film starred Michael J. Fox and 80s rocker Joan Jett, rivals to Reznor and Vale's band, The Problems. As The Problems, they performed a version of Buddy Holly's True Love Ways, with Reznor on keyboards. His screen time, however, was limited to just a few seconds, and Reznor was not inundated with offers from Hollywood. Whilst performing with Exotic Birds, Reznor continued to develop his own music, which was growing a little harder around the edges and becoming more intense. He became dispirited with the music of Exotic Birds, as it was no longer the sort of thing he felt he should be playing. Reznor eventually quit the band when he found a job as an assistant at a local 8-track recording studio. Working flat out doing odd jobs, even cleaning toilets, he eventually worked his way up the ladder to the position of engineer. His dedication to the studio was noticed and rewarded by him being given permission to work on his own material there during the evenings. With high levels of energy and determination, and using new skills and knowledge, Reznor worked all through the night, teaching himself many new techniques using MIDI computer applications. He played around with samples and sounds, including electric guitar, and through trial and error formed the sound that would soon become 9 Inch Nails. He particularly enjoyed working alone with no interference, and this was possible now as he was skilled enough to work without the assistance of other engineers. At his home he also practiced his techniques and worked on his lyrics, which had by now become very personal and expressive. By 1988, Reznor had recorded a tape which he gave to John Marm, who had managed several bands previously and now agreed to become the manager of 9 Inch Nails. 9 Inch Nails' first completed song, Down In It, found its way onto a 3-track demo with which Marm approached various labels and received quite a bit of interest along the way. To promote the band, Reznor and Marm took 9 Inch Nails on the road for a string of East Coast dates, where they occasionally opened for Skinny Puppy. Reznor was back in the drummer's seat, and the shows were a huge success. After one performance at New York's Irving Plaza, Reznor met Steve Gottlieb of TVT Records, a name which would be linked to Reznor for the next few years. 9 Inch Nails signed to TVT, and no time was wasted in getting Reznor and his demos into the studio to record what would be 9 Inch Nails' debut album, Pretty Hate Machine. A list of possible producers was put forward. Reznor wanted Flood, who was well respected and whose CV boasted the names U2 and Depeche Mode, but as he had prior engagements with the latter, he was only able to offer limited time to the 9 Inch Nails project. It was, however, long enough for him to form a friendship with Reznor, who would use him again on future recordings. The other 3 producers credited on the album were John Fryer, who had previously worked with the Cocteau Twins, and Tackhead's Adrian Sherwood and Keith LeBlanc. Reznor and Fryer spent a month in London recording the bulk of the album, an experience that Reznor disliked immensely. The pair did not see eye to eye, and eventually Fryer's material was reworked by LeBlanc in New York. Pretty Hate Machine's 10 tracks were written, played, arranged and programmed by Reznor, although he did require the help of Reznor to edit the songs. The record was quite accessible, due to its dance rhythm tracks and song structure, but still aggressive enough to inherit the industrial tag, a description which Reznor refused to accept. Comparisons were also made with New Order and Depeche Mode, due to the record's keyboard-heavy sound, although the bursts of grinding guitar produced a unique dance-metal combination. However, the first of many disagreements arose at this point between artist and label. TVT were not happy with the finished product, and Reznor was equally dissatisfied with Adrian Sherwood's mix of Down In It, which was in the place of his own version. Despite these differences, Down In It was the first of 3 singles to be taken from the album. It was well received and achieved reasonable sales, topping Rolling Stone's dance chart. The promotional video accompanying the single was the first of many controversial 9 Inch Nails videos. The FBI even investigated the low-budget film after a helium balloon with an attached camera had flown away after filming an apparently dead Reznor. The film was found by a shocked farmer who turned it in to the police, thinking it was a snuff movie. Despite the stir it caused, the film did eventually make its way onto MTV, but not until it had been heavily edited, much to Reznor's annoyance.
Cleveland is a very industrial city. I don't know if that's why it sounds the way it does. I don't know. I don't want to make that connection necessarily. But it's a fairly grim place. There's not a lot to go on. It's not Paris. It's just an ugly kind of Midwestern, town.
Reznor capitalised on the exposure that 9 Inch Nails had received through Pretty Hate Machine by taking the band on an extensive and intense tour at the beginning of 1990. Dates were planned for 9 Inch Nails to open for the Jesus and Mary Chain, to be followed by supporting ex-Bauhaus and Dali's Car member Pete Murphy. New musicians were recruited, including Chris Vrenna and former Exotic Birds member Nick Rush, as well as Richard Patrick on guitar. Nine Inch Nails was still very much Reznor's band, and he was still the same control freak, although he did allow for creative input from the other band members if it would in any way enhance the live Nine Inch Nails sound. They were a very different band live. The noise element was more extreme, and the sinister-looking Reznor, dressed in black leather with black makeup, would haunt the stage like a devil, smashing up instruments, attacking his band members, and abusing the audience. It was not an act for the squeamish. The noise was extremely aggressive, with its tribal beats, churning guitar, and screaming relentless feedback. The audience was being sonically assaulted, and they loved every minute of it. The shows with both the Jesus and Mary Chain and Pete Murphy were hugely successful, despite a fallout with Murphy's crew as a consequence of Reznor's onstage antics. Nine Inch Nails' reputation now preceded them, and they gained a loyal following of both fans and peers. Reznor was in demand and collaborated on a number of side projects, much against the wishes of TVTs. One such venture was covering Black Sabbath's Supernaut for the group 1000 Homo DJs, in turn a side project of Ministry's Al Jorgensen, who had produced Nine Inch Nails' B-side to Sin. TVT objected to Reznor's vocals being released on the Wax Trax label and demanded that they were removed. Jorgensen decided against this and distorted them beyond recognition before releasing the track. By this time, Reznor had completely fallen out with TVT, and in particular Steve Gottlieb, who Reznor felt had tried to make Nine Inch Nails more commercial. There were also disputes over royalties and cover art, a particular passion of Reznor's. The label tried to prevent Reznor from recording any more material until they had come to some sort of agreement over their differences. Reznor, meanwhile, tried to escape his contract, and the band continued to tour in order to pay their legal costs. Relations between the two camps became very strained and ugly, with Reznor refusing even to speak to the company and using interviews to get in a few low blows at Gottlieb's expense. A major turning point in the band's fortune occurred when they were invited to appear at the first Lollapalooza, an alternative US touring festival organised and headlined by Perry Farrell of Jane's Addiction. Nine Inch Nails were low on the bill, although they were already established within the alternative music scene, having sold over 350,000 copies of Pretty Hate Machine. Those who were not aware of their existence were soon confronted with it face to face at the Lollapalooza. With James Woolley playing keyboards and Jeff Ward of Ministry sitting in Chris Brenner's seat, Nine Inch Nails grabbed the audience and refused to let go. They certainly made a vicious impression with their loudest, most anarchic shows to date, and they received much credit, winning over new fans across the country. These shows were succeeded by a brief tour of Europe, during which they supported both Guns N' Roses and The Wonder Stuff, which was probably not the best calculated of career moves. Their music was of a radically different nature than those bands, and they were not surprised when they were not appreciated as a support band. Meanwhile, Reznor's less than ideal situation with TVT was about to change, with the help of Interscope Records, who stepped in with an acceptable offer. Part of the new deal would mean that Interscope would handle Nine Inch Nails' promotion and distribution, among other contractual agreements, and that TVT would receive a percentage of Nine Inch Nails' future sales. Though not quite the clean break that Reznor would have welcomed, it was still a vast progression, and it also meant that he would no longer have to deal with TVT or Gottlieb directly. With renewed optimism, Reznor went back into the studio, with Flood once again in tow, where they set about recording Nine Inch Nails' first release on Interscope. Broken was more of an EP than an album, and consisted of 6 tracks that were less of a departure from Nine Inch Nails' recent live sound than they were from their debut album 3 years earlier. Once again, none of the live band were used during the recording, which Reznor intended to make as vigorous and as harsh as possible. In fact, much of the anger and bitterness that inspired the recording came as a result of Reznor's ill feelings towards Gottlieb. Released in September 1992, Broken received generally favourable reviews, and Nine Inch Nails' ever-expanding audience helped it to reach the US National Top 10. For such an uncommercial record to reach the top 10 was impressive, and Reznor was keen to applaud the help and support he'd received from his new label. Broken was a dense affair, and contained many layers of noise and samples which Reznor and Flood had produced with obsessive attention to detail. Nine Inch Nails were truly defining their own instantly recognisable sound, and even though many of the tracks were not instantly accessible, with repeated listening they would seem to open up and reveal new sounds and melodies among the heavy droning layers. Reznor's rage was clearly evident on the record, both in the music and in his self-loathing lyrics. 2 bonus tracks were to be found on the record, either hidden towards the end of the CD or as a separate bonus 12-inch. One of these was a cover of an Adam and the Ants track entitled Physical, on which, under close scrutiny, Reznor can be heard whispering the line, "Eat your heart out, Steve." Although this was not easy to make out, it would not take a genius to work out that it was aimed at Gottlieb. No singles were released from the album, although Wish did win 9 Inch Nails a Grammy for the Best Metal Performance, another tag which Reznor would not have used to describe his music. 9 Inch Nails were attracting more and more media exposure, and it was becoming quite obvious that there would be no stopping them as their audience grew wider than Reznor could ever have hoped for. Unfortunately, not all of the exposure that 9 Inch Nails received was positive, and once again their videos were to cause quite a stir. A collection of these accompanied Broken, and although many of them were to feature controversial subject matter such as violence and bondage, it was the video of Happiness in Slavery which caused a vicious backlash. It was no secret that Reznor's music and image was darker than that of most of his contemporaries, but it was widely felt that he had perhaps gone too far this time. At least that was the opinion of the censors, who wasted no time in banning the video. Directed by Jonathan Rice, the disturbing film featured established performance artist Bob Flanagan being strapped naked and blindfolded to a sinister sexual contraption, which, besides torturing and sexually molesting him, eventually kills him. Reznor knew that the finished product was bound to attract such negative attention, but still felt the need to make the video, sticking by what he firmly believed in, artistic freedom. Having built up 9 Inch Nails' name and reputation considerably through touring extensively before recording the album, Reznor felt no desire to take Broken on the road. A few months after its release, a collection of remixes of the Broken tracks came out. Entitled Fixed, it featured radical reworkings by the likes of Butch Vig, who had produced Nirvana's Nevermind classic, as well as Reznor himself.
It's not a pure electronic show by any means, and we're not the kind of band that anyone can look at and say, oh, that's a definite example of this form of music, because it's a stew of a variety of things.
Having grown tired of Cleveland and the whole scene there, Reznor looked elsewhere for his next home and studio. Having opted for New Orleans, a property deal fell through and Reznor decided to live temporarily in Los Angeles, California. Although he was oblivious to it at the time, the house which Reznor chose to rent in Bel Air had a very dark and disturbing history. In 1969, the cult leader and Beatles fanatic Charles Manson led his followers, known as the Manson family, to commit a series of horrific murders at the house. One of the victims was the actress Sharon Tate, who was the pregnant wife of film director Roman Polanski and had also been Manson's lover. The 4 brutal murders revealed satanic overtones, with messages smeared on the walls in the victims' blood. These were references to the Beatles' lyrics, which Manson had claimed contained hidden messages and instructions. Reznor, who had already built a studio in the building, soon acknowledged the grim history of the house. During this period, he had been listening to a lot of layered and atmospheric music from the so-called Berlin albums of David Bowie and Iggy Pop. Of these albums, it was Bowie's Low that really caught Reznor's attention, and it became a source of inspiration during the recording process for 9 Inch Nails' next full-length album, The Downward Spiral. Reznor was suffering from regular bouts of depression, a condition that was not helped by the fact that he was struggling to overcome writer's block. He was trying to redefine his approach to both writing and recording by examining his demons and the negative energy of depression. As always, his lyrics were deep and personal, but he explored new territory with many of the songs. Key events from his life and a lack of satisfaction with success were themes he covered, along with familiar tales of violence, paranoia, and self-destruction. Other participants were brought in to contribute to the album, giving it a wider, more rounded and complete feel. Some of these faces were familiar, including Chris Vrenna and Flood, but there were new additions to the 9 Inch Nails camp. The most noticeable of these was ex-King Crimson guitarist Adrian Belew. A very talented and experienced musician, Belew was used to record guitar tracks, which Reznor then fed into a computer and experimented with, creating a whole new sound. With Reznor also playing guitar on the record and Alan Moulder at the mixing desk, the Downward Spiral's 14 songs were quite an eclectic mix, ranging from funky Prince-like numbers such as Piggy to the smoky atmospheric Hurt. Of course, Nine Inch Nails' trademark kick-ass aggression was never far away, although there seemed to be far more depth to it this time around. Many of the songs on the album were instantly accessible, sounding almost radio-friendly, until a sinister drum beat would creep up slowly and start unleashing its random crashes, eventually flooding the whole record with noise, as on Piggy or Closer, a track which featured drum samples from Iggy Pop's Nightclubbing, which starts off innocently enough before Reznor's sexually explicit lyrics are unleashed, guaranteeing it a cult following and an anticipated lack of airplay. Released in March 1994, The Downward Spiral entered the Billboard charts at number 2, gathering huge amounts of praise on the way, from critics who were genuinely impressed with the degree of complexity and quality which Reznor had revealed. Accolades were heaped upon him, and although he still felt uncomfortable with this success, it did bring in the financial rewards which he would soon put to good use by forming his own record label. Some of the songs from the album were accompanied by videos, including the controversial Closer, which featured the work of established pop director Mark Romanek, who had previously worked with the likes of Madonna and Michael Jackson. Although these artists could not have been further away from Nine Inch Nails, Romanek beautifully shot his bleak film in a manner which was appropriate to the song's creator, and Reznor was extremely pleased with the finished product, which was frequently shown on MTV after various degrees of editing. Whilst Reznor was living and recording at the house, nicknamed Le Pig with reference to Manson's messages, another Manson was to spend some time in residency. The Florida-based Marilyn Manson, whose band members took their names from a combination of female icons and serial murderers, recorded tracks for their debut album at the house. Reznor had been keen to help out the controversial band, who were excited at being able to record at Le Pig, and were also fortunate in their timing, as the house was demolished shortly after The Downward Spiral was completed.
As of recently, we've become very inconsistent, I think, because if we're not in the mood to play, or if we played this stuff so many times. I mean, if we don't create that chaos and that emotion when we walk on stage, or we're in front of an apathetic audience.
With the help of John Malm and the cooperation of Interscope, Reznor set up his own record label, a project he had been toying with for some time. Nothing Records was created in order to give other less recognised bands admired and respected by Reznor a platform and a label that would look after them in a way that he felt TVT had not looked after Nine Inch Nails. The bands that were signed to the label all shared the same individuality. Reznor and Malm would give these artists the freedom they needed and not try to shape or change them in any way. It was a fresh approach and a side of the industry that Reznor enjoyed working in, given that it was now in his hands. One of the first bands that signed to the label were Reznor's old friends, Marilyn Manson. He liked their alternative approach and attitude, and although he knew that they would cause controversy for the label, he did not try to tone them down, feeling that rock and roll was supposed to be scary, and was meant to be disliked by parents and politicians. Manson's lyrics were controversial. The subject matter was hardly kid stuff, dealing with uncomfortable matters such as brutal sex and murder. Manson's debut album, Portrait of an American Family, was soon released on nothing, with Reznor becoming intensely involved in the recording and production. Other groups that signed to the label included Coil, Pop Will Eat Itself, and Prick, who were fronted by Reznor's former bandmate in Lucky Pierre, Kevin McMahon. Besides recording with his new label mates, Reznor collaborated on a series of small projects. He contributed to Tori Amos's Past the Mission, which seemed an unlikely pairing but actually worked remarkably well. He also became involved in movie soundtracks, a genre that he had regularly expressed a strong interest in. Reznor's cover of Joy Division's Dead Souls appeared in the movie The Crow. This was a dark gothic film which was well suited to Reznor's music. Another collaboration from around this period was to require a lot more input from Reznor. Oliver Stone, the infamous director of many controversial films including JFK and Platoon, approached Reznor and persuaded him to work on the soundtrack for his new movie, Natural Born Killers, a film about a young couple's killing spree across the USA and the consequences of those events. As well as donating 3 Nine Inch Nails songs to the project, Reznor compiled and produced the soundtrack, which also featured the music of Leonard Cohen and Dr. Dre. His thorough and original approach to Natural Born Killers would later lead to other opportunities within that particular field. Although Reznor enjoyed working outside of Nine Inch Nails, he felt that the Downward Spiral should be taken out on the road. An eventful summer of touring was embarked upon, with the high point arising as a result of the band's memorable appearance at the second Woodstock Festival. Those who joined Reznor for the tour included new live members Robin Fink and Danny Lohner, as well as old favourites Chris Renner and James Woolley. As in previous tours, Reznor intended to create a live sound that was a reworking of their recorded material. Not only was the sound a progression, but a lot of effort was also made to ensure that the shows were more of a spectacle. A rubber fetish backdrop hovered eerily behind the band, who were surrounded by the harsh, violent glare of strobe lights. It was a stunning image, with Reznor performing as theatrically as ever, smashing up equipment and instruments, and then diving into the chaotic mosh pit. The band was certainly enjoying themselves on the tour, and this was more than evident when they appeared in August 1994 at upstate New York's Woodstock 2 Festival. The original and groundbreaking festival, entitled Woodstock Music and Arts Festival, had taken place a quarter of a century before its successor and attracted over 500,000 people during the 3-day event. Back in 1969, the likes of Jimi Hendrix, the band, and Creedence Clearwater Revival, as well as various hallucinogenic substances, entertained the festival goers. By 1994, music had changed somewhat, although there were still a few hangers-on from the original party, such as Santana and Joe Cocker, among others. In 1994, the eclectic lineup was generally of an alternative nature. Among those who grabbed the limelight were Metallica, Porno for Pyros, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and, of course, Nine Inch Nails. Prior to their performance, Reznor and co were feeling nervous about performing in front of such a big audience, well aware of the fact that the festival was also being broadcast live on television to those who weren't prepared to pay for the experience. The tension was soon to disappear as the band became involved in a mud fight just minutes before going on stage. This helped to get much of the apprehension out of their systems, and they swiftly took to the stage, having no time to clean themselves up. The band were literally covered in mud, which dripped onto their instruments and equipment, causing technical difficulties. As far as the audience were concerned, though, this subpar audio performance was nothing short of impressive, and within days of the show, the band's stature had once again grown considerably, as did the sales of the Downward Spiral, which began to climb back up the charts. Meanwhile, Nine Inch Nails continued to tour, playing to packed-out venues and disappointing the ever-increasing number of fans who were unable to get their tickets. During some of these shows, Reznor was joined on stage by Adam Ant, who performed a couple of tracks with the band, including Physical, the Adam Ant track which Reznor had covered a few years before. Another band who were getting their own fair share of attention were Marilyn Manson. The increasingly controversial rockers were making headlines with their antics both on and off the stage. They supported the Nine Inch Nails for part of their tour, as Reznor was keen to help promote the band, who were rapidly gathering their own loyal followers. Hole, fronted by Courtney Love, the widow of Nirvana's Kurt Cobain, was another band who supported Nine Inch Nails on the tour. Love already possessed something of a reputation, and was frequently bad-mouthing anyone who dared to cross her path. Although Hole were only booked for 6 shows, it was more than enough time for her to fall out with Reznor and many other members of the Nine Inch Nails entourage. The extremely competitive Love almost immediately caused friction between the two parties when she was heard verbally abusing Reznor and his band during one of her performances as support. The situation got worse before it improved, with Love making many allegations against Reznor, including claims that they had become sexually involved, a claim which Reznor wasted no time in denying. By the time Hole had finished supporting Nine Inch Nails, Reznor and Love had sorted out their differences, although there would be no denying that Reznor was glad to see the back of her. By the end of 1994, Reznor's effort and hard work had paid off. Nine Inch Nails could not put a foot wrong, at least not in the eyes of their fans. They featured heavily in end-of-year polls, and the readers of Rolling Stone voted Closer the year's best single. Trent Reznor was voted Artist of the Year by both Musician and Spin, whilst The Downward Spiral was nominated for a Grammy in the Best Alternative Album category. Unfortunately for Reznor, the award went to retro-punk rockers Green Day, but it was good to see that the music industry was at last taking note of Nine Inch Nails' talents. Despite the fact that The Downward Spiral did not receive the Grammy that so many people felt it had thoroughly deserved, its extremely credible reputation was enough to establish Reznor as one of the hottest properties in the business.
What's interesting about the studio versus live, the studio is where all the thought goes into it, and that's where I think the art is created. Live, it's kind of recreating something, reinterpreting it in a very visceral, there it is, let's see what happens, kind of confrontational way.
In 1995, Reznor finally moved to New Orleans, a city he had always enjoyed visiting. He built a studio there which was located in a building that had once housed a funeral home. This added much to the character and atmosphere of the studio, and Reznor spent a lot of time there trying out new ideas and experimenting. It was obvious that Reznor was as keen as ever for Nine Inch Nails to break through any barriers in order to explore new musical environments. Before he could fully take on these new challenges, he would spend more time in the studio, this time working on another album of Nine Inch Nails remixes entitled Further Down the Spiral. Much as Fixed had been a few years before, these were remixes of tracks from Nine Inch Nails' last release, showcasing the talents of Reznor's friends Rick Rubin and Coil amongst others. The remix album was understandably a huge financial success, and it was certainly embraced by fans of the group, who were unaware that this would be the last major Nine Inch Nails release for quite some time. Reznor continued to collaborate with other bands, and Marilyn Manson still featured prominently in Reznor's schedule. In fact, their next release, Smells Like Children, was produced with Reznor's help. A commotion was stirring, as outraged politicians were jumping on the bandwagon and criticising the lyrical content of many so-called gangster rap tracks, stating that these lyrics were setting the wrong example for America's youth. It was not long before Reznor's lyrics to Big Man with a Gun provoked quite a reaction, understandably, and the controversy surrounding these lyrics was strong enough to force Time Warner to sell their 50% share in Interscope Records to MCA. Towards the end of 1995, Nine Inch Nails were invited to appear with David Bowie on his Outside tour. Reznor had recently remixed the first single from Bowie's Outside album. Bowie was a huge fan of Reznor's work, and Reznor had kept no secrets regarding his admiration for Bowie. However, by 1995, Bowie had long since passed his peak and was trying to re-establish himself with a new album, which experimented with more contemporary styles. Having Nine Inch Nails at hand certainly offered Bowie the opportunity to play to a new audience, many of whom had come specifically to see Nine Inch Nails and knew little about Bowie and his once great past. Although Bowie was the headline act, he was kind enough to allow Nine Inch Nails to share the limelight by merging their sets together, with Nine Inch Nails playing with Bowie and vice versa. The mutual respect was obvious, though Reznor later admitted that he felt intimidated to be playing with such a musical legend. However, the shows went successfully, although it was unlikely that Bowie would have won over many new fans with his material, most of which was new or obscure. Nine Inch Nails followed these dates with a series of small club gigs in the southern states, which were far more intimate than their recent shows with Bowie. Once again, Reznor retreated to his studio, where he soon began working on the soundtrack to a new computer game called Quake, similar to the best-selling Doom, which Reznor himself was a big fan of. It was a very dark and frightening game, not short of extreme violence. Reznor created an ambient accompaniment for the game, which added dramatically to the dense atmosphere that existed within the game's gloomy corridors. Quake sold extremely well and gained cult status among the game-playing community. Reznor enjoyed working on the project and revealed that he would like to produce more of this kind of work in the future. He continued to remix and produce other people's work, covering a lot of ground musically, whether it was working with Puff Daddy, Marilyn Manson or David Bowie. Having taken a back seat regarding live performances, Nine Inch Nails surprised many fans by appearing in New York at a Nothing Records showcase, which featured bands from the label. Marilyn Manson's set was cut short due to a guitar-throwing incident which injured one of the band members. Nine Inch Nails headlined the evening, but it was a rare sighting of the band who would once again withdraw from the public limelight. Once more, Reznor's services were required for more soundtrack collaborations, this time with a director who he truly admired. David Lynch was generally regarded as one of the film industry's true maverick filmmakers, and through films such as Eraserhead, Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart, which had all revealed a very dark and sinister undercurrent, he had gained a loyal following. Reznor was impressed with Lynch's canon of work, as well as his enthusiasm and understanding for the use of music in film. The pair briefly worked together at Reznor's studio, which was a revelation to Reznor as he was introduced to a new way of working. However, Reznor preferred to work alone, and was soon doing just that. There was certainly less pressure involved, and he was able to lose himself in the work in progress. The final result of Reznor's film-inspired work included 2 atmospheric instrumentals, as well as a new Nine Inch Nails track, The Perfect Drug, which would eventually be released as a single. It had, however, been leaked to the public beforehand. Somehow, the Los Angeles radio station K-Rock received a copy of the track through the internet, which it then proceeded to play during its show, generating a lot of attention. The Lost Highway soundtrack also included new music from Lou Reed, Smashing Pumpkins and Marilyn Manson. Needless to say, the whole experience was enjoyed by Reznor, who once more was broadening his musical horizons. Nine Inch Nails' music was starting to appear in other films, which were generally of a dark nature. 2 of these films were Seven, which starred Brad Pitt, and the below-average Robert De Niro film entitled The Fan. 2 of these films were Seven, which starred Brad Pitt, and the below-average Robert De Niro film entitled The Fan. Unfortunately for Nine Inch Nails fans, these recordings were not included on the album of the soundtracks when they were finally released.
I think my audience is a very loyal core audience that are people that like me for the right reason, and I'm not going to abandon them and try to reach people that don't understand what I'm trying to do, and I'm not going to cater to a format I hate, and I'm not going to make a glossy MTV video when I don't like it to start with.
Reznor was soon back in the studio, working on the next Nine Inch Nails album. He had hinted that the record would become more beat-heavy and more reminiscent of hip-hop than any other musical category. These claims raised many an eyebrow, and the album soon became one of music's most eagerly awaited releases. Appetites were whet when the bizarre and brief commercials were aired on MTV. These featured Nine Inch Nails' familiar logo, whilst new music pounded away in the background. It was enough to generate excitement amongst Nine Inch Nails' patient audience, and would keep them guessing for a while longer. Reznor and Manson had meanwhile publicly fallen out, when Manson released his autobiography and made comments that were less than kind about his label boss and one-time friend. Reznor was not impressed with this, and would soon have something to say about the matter. The Fragile, Nine Inch Nails' first album in 5 years, was unleashed in September 1999. The album's 23 tracks span 2 CDs or 6 sides of vinyl, depending on preference. Produced and largely recorded by Reznor, the album also bears the names of more contributors than Nine Inch Nails' previous releases. Alan Moulder worked again on the mixing, whilst Reznor had used Bob Ezrin on sequencing. Ezrin paid his dues in music, working with many groups, including Reznor's old heroes Kiss and Lou Reed, whose 1973 sombre masterpiece Transformer he produced. Adrian Belew was once again in attendance, as well as Bowie's keyboard player Mike Garson. The album certainly includes a wide range of experienced musicians, which gives the work a more diverse, eclectic feel than that of Nine Inch Nails' former releases. Reznor is as experimental as ever, and the promised hip-hop beats are there for all to see, although occasionally one has to look hard to find them. Drum and bass rhythms make an appearance, pounding away beneath Reznor's more familiar, aggressive guitar samples. More of Nine Inch Nails' regular trademarks are clearly evident on the record, which at times is more hard-hitting than ever. The first part of the album is the harshest, and includes the single The Day the World Went Away. Although the record is not short of melody, and actually sounds more accessible than The Downward Spiral, it still retains the sharp, dangerous edge that has always existed in Nine Inch Nails' music. One of the more aggressive numbers, Starfucker Inc., is a direct slap in the face of former friend Manson, still recording for Reznor's Nothing Records. The most striking feature of The Fragile is the subtle use of ambient sounds and textures, particularly on the album's second part. Cellos and upright bass were used during the recording, and the penultimate track underneath it all even carries a slightly Eastern feel. Reznor's knowledge of the piano is frequently called upon, and often creates calming moments of real beauty, especially on La Mer, which is backed up by some deliciously funky beats. Reznor's lyrics, however, are still as bleak as ever, dealing with familiar subjects such as self-loathing and bitterness, betrayal and pain. Yet somehow he sounds more assured on this album. At last, Reznor's dedication, experimentation, risk-taking and sheer individual brilliance have gained their rightly deserved recognition and respect, illustrated by The Fragiles entering the Billboard charts at number 1. The band have also gained widespread critical acclaim, the album being hailed as a masterpiece throughout the music press. Whether this widespread appeal and unprecedented level of success was Reznor's ultimate aim is somewhat questionable. Though his passion for and dedication to the music he believes in has at last been fully acknowledged, it is difficult to know whether Reznor will be comfortable with such a degree of mainstream popularity and exposure. And where will Reznor and Nine Inch Nails go from here? About the only thing we can be fairly sure of is that given Reznor's nature, there will be more surprises in store.